think when you look today at the sort of debate, the discussions that happen between American politicians or government officials about Mexico, it's usually about immigration. It's usually about President Trump talked a lot about building a wall, for example. He talked about Mexican immigrants largely not being they're not sending their best. He said something that they're mostly sort of rapists and drug dealers. He had a lot of nasty things to say about Mexico. And that's a long-standing dynamic. There's been sort of criticism and sort of xenophobic racism aimed towards Mexicans from the United States for a long time. And a lot of Americans look at Mexico sort of as, as a poor country to our south. There's a lot of association with the drug trade, which certainly is true to some extent, but obviously Americans are involved in the drug trade also. And so I want to kind of get to the origins of our relationship today with Mexico, and it really dates back into the 1840s. And so that's where we'll begin our discussion today, the 1840s. This is what the map looked like after Texas independence. So Texas fought their own war for independence from Mexico in 1836. It was successful. They declared their independence in 1836, and they were an independent nation until they joined the United States in 1845. Now, in 1845, there was a debate between the United States and Mexico, sort of a disagreement about where exactly the border was. So Mexico thought the border was sort of the line I'm drawing now. It's called the Nueces River. And so they thought Texas was, frankly, pretty small. Texas, as you know, today is known for everything big. That's sort of the original argument from Texas, that they are bigger than the Americans, and the Texans said, in fact, the border is the Rio Grande River, which is a little farther south. At the southernmost point, it's not so different, but as you get farther west, it's a huge, huge difference. And so ultimately, the Americans said this disputed area was Texas and therefore the United States also, whereas Mexico said firmly no, that the border is actually much farther north at the Nueces River. I want to show you just a slightly bigger picture of this. So let me clear off the annotations. You can see, right, the Nueces River here is what the Mexicans said the border was, and the Americans said it was farther south down here, the Rio Grande River. And so this is sort of the disputed territory, this area between the two rivers here. In southern Texas, what's now southern Texas. So the one thing you can pick up on right away is that, in fact, the border of today is down here at the Rio Grande River. That tells you pretty conclusively that the United States, in fact, was victorious in this conflict. It wasn't particularly close. The United States really ran over the Mexican army in no time. The beginning of the war revolves around this border dispute. So American troops led by General Zachary Taylor, who would become the next president after the war, he was elected sort of in celebration of his victory in this war. He marched American troops on the president's orders into this sort of disputed territory, into this area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River, which the United States thought was theirs, which Mexico thought was theirs. It was absolutely a deliberate provocation. He was hoping that the Mexicans would attack. Ultimately, they did. They felt that they had no choice, but they weren't interested in going to war. They tried to negotiate, they tried to settle, unsuccessfully. The president at the time had actually proposed buying California a year or two earlier. The Mexicans said no thank you. They thought it wasn't worth selling California. Obviously, they weren't predicting what happened, and so President Polk was an expansionist, was a hawk. A hawk is a term that we use to sort of refer to people who want war, who want conflict, and President Polk was absolutely a hawk. He was a Jacksonian, meaning he was sort of mentored and followed in the footsteps of Andrew Jackson, who's responsible for the Indian Removal Act we talked about earlier. And so Polk marched the American troops into battle, organized the war. It was a war of choice. It wasn't sort of, we have no choice. It wasn't, we have this existential conflict. It was ultimately, we want that over there. And as a result, the conflict began, and the Americans marched into war with excitement, with enthusiasm. Americans generally like war. I can't quite sort of justify that or explain that in any great detail, but Americans generally like war. They vote for war consistently, in part because a lot of the wars we have been involved in have been extremely profitable, extremely sort of, there's been a real benefit to America from previous wars. However, 1846 also saw the birth of the American anti-war movement, and it's been a part of every war since then. Even sort of otherwise popular wars like World War II, there was a significant anti-war movement. They responded to a frenzy of pro-war hysteria. Right here in New York, marchers carried signs reading "Mexico or death." You even heard the argument in some places, especially in New York and Massachusetts, that the war was good for Mexico. It was this same sort of paternalistic attitude that we talked about related to Native Americans. The idea was that Mexicans would be grateful for our invading forces because we were bringing them democracy. It's such a strange way of thinking about history. And in fact, it's the message that recurs when I was in high school in 2003, I was your age, the United States declared war on Iraq and organized an invading force. In fact, we still have some small number of troops in Iraq today. And the same message was offered by the president, President George W. Bush, and his vice president, Dick Cheney. They said, well, the Iraqis will be excited to have us arrive. They'll greet us as liberators. That's just a fiction. No one has ever been very grateful for being invaded, at least that I know of. And so it's an argument that really has no basis in fact. Americans did speak out against the war in a way that was exciting to many people because there was some sort of pushback against the government. A famous author named Henry David Thoreau, who was famous for Walden at the time and later wrote on the duty of civil disobedience, actually went to prison in 1846 for a couple of days over his refusal to pay taxes. He said, I won't pay taxes that would fund the war. Ultimately, he makes an argument that would be adopted by Dr. Martin Luther King, by Mahatma Gandhi in India, and by many others, saying essentially that there is a difference between the law of the land and the law of your conscience. Dr. King would describe it as the difference between man's law and God's law. He would say ultimately, and both of them would agree ultimately, that your own judgment of what's right is more important than a law. It's worth remembering that everything Hitler did in Germany during World War II was legal because he made the laws. Likewise, slavery was legal. Indian removal was legal. The laws of the land are not always right, are not always worth following. They're worth interrogating, Thoreau argues, for themselves. The other major opponent to the Mexican-American War was Abraham Lincoln, who was in his first term as a congressman from Illinois. He lashed out against the war. He called it immoral, pro-slavery, and a threat to the nation's Republican values. In response to his sort of outspokenness, he was taken off the ballot for re-election. The party that nominated him, the Whig Party, was supportive of the war. So they said, actually, we're not interested in supporting your re-election. As a result, Lincoln, when he finally was elected president about 12 years later in 1860, he was the first Republican president. Now, the parties have changed quite a bit since then. We'll talk more later about the difference between the political parties, but I think it's important to understand that Lincoln sort of founded the Republican Party. He was so kind of pushed out of his own party by this opposition to the war that he had to start a new political party. That's how extreme it was, especially because the war ended in a great victory. Americans marched through Mexico with relatively little opposition. The Mexican army wasn't organized for a fight. You can see the Americans, although they started the war in that disputed area, ultimately they would march. Here's where we began the war, Zachary Taylor's troops right along the border between those two rivers. You can see the naval superiority is what really made a difference for the Americans on their way to Mexico City, which is where the final battle of the war took place. Likewise, out west, the American Navy played a big role in combating Mexicans in that part of the country. And ultimately, the Mexican army wasn't prepared for this level of conflict spread out across such a large area. They were able to hold their own in sort of particular battles, but ultimately the widespread nature of the war meant that Mexico just didn't have the resources to keep up with the Americans. What was the impact of the war? Well, this is the American map in 1840. All this area in the West is not ours, is not part of the United States. And by 1850, Texas and California have become states. The Utah and New Mexico territory are sort of waiting to become states. And the United States has taken on the shape that you would recognize from maps today. It sort of fulfills its quote unquote manifest destiny. Along the way, of course, a few thousand Mexicans and a few thousand Native people were killed. Over 1 million enslaved Africans would work the sort of farmland of this new territory that was added. And ultimately, just 10 years later in 1860, the question of slavery would become so sort of hostile in our nation's capital, that it would lead to the Civil War. So that's all I wanted to review today. I want to pause and at this point ask for questions.